It is a global media network with dozens of bureaus from Abu Dhabi to Hong Kong. In 2014, CNN US reaped $338 million of advertising revenue, contributing about 7% of the total value of the giant media conglomerate which owns it, Time Warner, according to Forbes magazine. Launched in 1980 by Ted Turner, the station has made its biggest impact through its coverage of international events. On the station's 25th anniversary, Turner bragged, "Where would we be today if networks like CNN had not been there to capture people power as the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union collapsed? What about the real-time images of the 1991 Gulf War? And none of us can forget the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. But it isn't just famed for covering these events. The network has given its name to the CNN effect, wherein the news coverage of war becomes part of the war itself. Back in 1968, a fiercely competitive southern businessman named Ted Turner bought his first television station, the small Atlanta broadcaster WJRJ, and within a dozen years he would launch CNN, which would become a world-famous news channel and make Turner into a bumpkin billionaire. Cable television, which originated in regional networks aiming to overcome bad signals in mountainous or distant areas in places like Arkansas and Pennsylvania, came into its own in the 1980s. And with new cable technologies, Ted Turner had his opening. So he invested his money in two key cable networks: ESPN, the all-sports network set up in 1979, and CNN, the all-news channel launched in June 1980. Reflecting on his options, he told his business partner Reese Schonfeld, as reported in 1996 in Philly.com, "There are only four things that television does, Reese. It does movies, and HBO has beaten me to that. It does sports, and now ESPN's got that. There's the regular kind of stuff, and the three networks have beaten me to that. All that's left is news, and I've got to get there before anyone else does, or I'm going to be shut out." The irony is that Turner didn't really like the idea of a news channel. Tim Wu, writing for Slate magazine, quotes the media mogul as saying, "I hate news. News is evil. It makes people feel bad." And initially, at least, CNN did quite poorly. Although 1.7 million people watched the first broadcast, viewership for the first few years was in the tens of thousands. It was losing $1 million a month in its first 2 years. And what made the investment pay off in the end was simply this: CNN made itself invaluable to state personnel. By virtue of its 24-hour coverage and its international scope, it gained influence in exchange for portraying events more or less as policymakers wanted them to. A curious fact about CNN is that it acquired a reputation for liberal bias among conservatives. By the 1990s, it was dubbed the Clinton News Network. This is certainly not a reputation it ever courted. One of the major careers it helped launch was that of the anti-immigrant reactionary Lou Dobbs, who in the last decade could be found regularly complaining about illegal aliens. And he eventually resigned when he stepped over the mark by claiming that Obama was not a US citizen, as Time magazine reported. And today, he has moved on to Fox News, where he's supporting Donald Trump, as the Daily Beast reports. On climate change, the president of CNN Worldwide professes to be struggling to find a way to communicate the problem to broad audiences, as reported on Politico Media. So it decided to bring on the far-right shock jock Ann Coulter to describe it as a rich white person's concern. However, the crux of CNN's relationship to the political establishment is its role in the reporting of wars. CNN reached its zenith in 1991 when it reported the beginning of the Iraq War, with Wolf Blitzer reporting for the Pentagon and journalists reporting from the Al Rashid Hotel live from Baghdad, Saudi Arabia and Israel. As Variety magazine reported at the time, CNN managed to reach 10.8 million homes. After another year of declining audience share, the broadcast nets were looking to prove their indispensability in an international crisis. Instead, they found themselves upstaged by a 10-year-old cable news service, further shifting the balance of power in cable's direction. While CNN's reporting of the war captured the market and made Wolf Blitzer's name, its reporting is notable for a few things that generally aren't remarked upon. First of all, its coverage was almost entirely focused on the how rather than the why. There was little analysis of the rationale for war other than that offered by officials, only breathless discussion of the technicalities. Second, every witness interviewed by the program, including the experts ranging from former Reagan Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger to General Schwarzkopf, and the human interest segment with the spouse of a serving soldier and her daughter, was pro-war. Weinberger's contribution, aside from lauding America's tactical success, reassured audiences that the targets will have been very carefully chosen to be military only and to be well away from any kind of civilian casualty damage. Third, the channel's reporters had no problem becoming auxiliaries of the US government foreign policy. In a recollection of the channel's glory days, published almost a quarter of a century later, Wolf Blitzer describes his role as the military affairs reporter during what he described as Iraq's brutal military occupation of Kuwait, a term that would strikingly never be used by a CNN anchor about the US occupation of Iraq. He reports that having stated on air that the US response to the occupation was unclear, he was quickly called and scolded by a senior Pentagon official who told him that this was going to encourage Saddam and to say on air that all options are on the table, including the military option. Blitzer adds, "Within a few minutes, I was reporting that information live around the world." One CNN reporter who attempted something like journalism was Peter Arnett. When the US Air Force bombed a factory at Abu Ghraib in January 1991, they claimed that it was a biological weapons factory. Arnett was skeptical since he had toured the plant previously and argued, whatever else it did produce infant formula, as The Intercept reports. For this, even though his account would later be corroborated, as Mark Crispin Miller writes at Alternet, he was accused of treason by the White House. Nonetheless, in most of its reporting, there was no reporting. In brief, the CNN effect, predicated on covering of conflict with fast and simple video segments repeating approved talking points, is a propaganda effect. CNN would also play an interesting role in wars in the later 1990s. For example, when the US government, in the course of the Kosovo War, bombed Serbian television headquarters in Belgrade, CNN was given the usual warning by the government and evacuated its journalists. But, as Robert Fisk reported in The Independent, a day later, Serbian Information Minister Aleksandar Vučić received a faxed invitation from the Larry King Live show in the US to appear on CNN. They wanted him on air at 2:30 in the morning of 23rd of April and asked him to arrive at Serb television half an hour early for makeup. Vučić was late, which was just as well for him since NATO missiles slammed into the building at 6 minutes past 2. Skeptically, Fisk added, CNN calls this all a coincidence. In fact, some surprising links between the CNN and the military establishment were uncovered in the following year when the Dutch journalist Abe de Vries discovered that personnel from Fort Bragg's PSYOPs unit had been working in CNN. Strange to relate, as Alexander Coburn wrote in the San Jose Mercury News, no mainstream news media in the United States has evinced any interest in the story. With this in mind, it was incredibly fortuitous for CNN that it was the first station to broadcast news of the Twin Towers attack in 2001, because CNN would move quickly to align itself with the Bush administration and its war effort. Its first step in doing this was to produce a 30-second video montage themed on the attacks, patriotism, the Bush administration, and CNN, which concluded with a shot of the American flag overlaid with the slogan, "A New Spirit." The channel's coverage of the coming war was predictably in that spirit. For example, among the instructions conveyed by the channel's president to reporters was that whenever reporting anything about civilian casualties from the bombing of Afghanistan, they should counter it by stressing the enormity of the 9/11 attacks. As the US invaded Iraq, it was even a matter of controversy whether civilian casualties should be reported at all. In April 2004, CNN anchor Darren Kagan interviewed Al Jazeera's editor-in-chief Ahmed al-Sheikh, shown in a partial transcript at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting. Kagan complained about his network's reporting of civilian casualties. Even if the reporting was accurate, he said, wasn't the bigger story what the Iraq insurgents are doing to provoke US forces? In other words, he wanted Al Jazeera to frame the story from the point of view of the Pentagon. Occasionally, if Democrats would make tactical criticisms of the war, CNN would be on hand to bolster the administration, as its senior political advisor Bill Schneider demanded, "What's the Democrats' plan? What's their strategy? Do they have a plan for victory in this war?" This was the only question that was on the table for CNN. In September 2006, host John Roberts reacted to a poll showing that 65% of Iraqis wanted the occupation to end immediately. Why would people in Iraq want the United States to pull out immediately, particularly since all of the analysis and a lot of statements from people there in Iraq are saying that if the United States pulled out, the whole place would devolve into civil war almost immediately? This statement was made at the height of the Civil War that had in fact taken off under the occupation. CNN never really stood down from its war footing. By 2015, it was still prominently reporting terror alerts from the Department of Homeland Security, even where, as in the case of the supposed terrorist threats to the 4th of July celebrations, there was no specific credible intelligence to indicate any threats, as its website article finally acknowledged by the 10th paragraph. But this is standard CNN fare. In the aftermath of the Paris attacks, the journalist Glenn Greenwald, criticizing the channel's nationalist fear-mongering, wrote in The Intercept that CNN has basically become state TV. Well, as Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman once showed, almost all news is state news. But CNN has been energetically embracing that position and profiting from it for over 35 years.